So now we're talking about backwards design, and I want to take us back to the work that you guys did with mission. What do you want your students to be able to know, do, and consider when they leave you? When a student's done with your biology class or your performance class or your social studies class, what should they sound like? What should they be able to talk about? What should they be able to talk like? What should they be able to read? What should they be able to create after they're all done with your course or within a grade level or in your school? UbD is all about starting with the end. So from that point, you can back map how to get to where it is that you want to go. So start with the results. Forget about how you're going to teach it, but begin with what it is you want the students to look like when they're done. Early in my career, I was a very content focused teacher because that was my training. And when I first took my job, the curriculum was literally a book outline for world history. Each chapter was listed in the curriculum guide. It had the information followed by a little thing about possible activities. And at first, I stuck with that because my knowledge about Charlemagne in the medieval European history was very limited, and the book provided a very safe space. But as I grew as a teacher and I began to become a more results focused teacher, I decided things such as my students needed to be proficient public speakers. So I determined what topics, units, and concepts were best suited for them to demonstrate that ability. I then had to decide what I wanted them to do. Did I want them to just be able to do informative speeches or persuasive speeches? How long did I want them to speak? Did being proficient speakers mean also engaging just in conversation during group works? Then after that, I had to determine, well, what was good work in my class? What work met the standard? What work exceeded the standard? And what needed more improvement? Then after all of that was done, that's when I began to design my instruction and how I was going to go about teaching. I had the why down, I had the what down. It's not until after that that I figured out the how that it was going to take place. And again, with the twin sins, this slide really talks to, and Wiggins and McTighe talk about this a lot, the skills, knowledge, and content in your class. And I mentioned this a little bit ago about the apples. What is worth spending academic time in your class for students to know, think, and do? There's no such thing as free time in your classroom. And I used to tell my teachers, I don't know what that term free time is. I didn't know if it was French or Spanish or what. If it's worthy to be learned in your classroom, then the materials and resources become secondary and even tertiary to the process, because knowing how you're going to measure success is just as critical as establishing your desired results. So teachers need to ask those questions there. What should they walk out the door knowing how to do, and the content and their skills? How will I know it when I see it? And then what things will get them to that result? And just one last word to kind of wrap this up, as we talked about content versus results driven. Quite often, when you're talking about content focused instruction, you're just simply throwing stuff against the wall and you're just trying to see, all right, what they remember. That's why so many of us have taken objective tests, true false tests, and we get it through one ear, and then shortly after the test is over, it slowly oozes out of the other one. Um, I'm going to tell this to each of you: never give a true and false test, and very minimally give multiple choice tests. Get rid of objective tests and see how that changes your instruction. That way, you're not just throwing stuff on the wall, you're making sure you're creating authentic assessments that are truly going to determine what it is that your students are learning. Now, Wiggins and McTighe talk about this in terms of the way that a lot of teachers were trained and how to do lesson and curriculum design. And this is how I was trained. In fact, when I first started teaching in the mid 90s, we weren't using the rubrics that are talked about there on the number three. Most of you have probably used rubrics as students and will use them during your educational career. But when I was teaching, the first thing you did was you wrote out your objectives. The student will be able to list the generals of the Civil War. Then I figured out how I was going to teach that. They're going to list them, then I need to tell them who they are. Well, the best way to do that is the lecture. Or maybe it was something else where I figured they were going to work in groups or do it in class reading. Then after that, I determined my assessment. What was the best way for me to determine if the students could, say for example, label a map? Or what was the best way for me to determine whether or not they could compare and contrast the causes of World War I and World War II? Maybe I would use a Venn diagram. That was the extent of the class. I'd grade their work, turn it in, and then we would move on and do the next thing. So contrast that to what it is I'm about to describe to you guys as we flip the script. As I said, understanding by design flipped the script. When I started to teach and plan in this way, I had to determine why it was important for my students to have those map skills. And then I had to determine how they would demonstrate those map skills. I needed to figure out why they needed to understand the historical processes of cause and effect. So how would they show that to me? And maybe it was labeling the map. Maybe it was drawing a map. Or maybe it was listing the countries by region. Or if it came down to cause and effect, maybe I had to have them write a short answer essay, because that was the best way for them to show the similarities and differences between the causes of World War I and World War II. Then from that, that's when I would go ahead and plan what it was that I was going to do in terms of my pedagogy. Again, maybe now I use group work to get them to discuss the similarities and differences there. Maybe it was some independent work on labeling the map. Or maybe I did a brief mini lesson on writing a paragraph in that short answer essay so they could then go back and do it on their own. So that kind of changes up the way in which I had to think about assessment in particular as I started with where I wanted them to be as my first step in designing my instruction. Now, in understanding by design, there are three different stages. We're going to go over these in far more detail as the class moves forward because you guys are going to be doing a unit and lesson plan, as you guys have probably read in the syllabus. But briefly, in stage one, again, you start with the end in mind, then you figure out the evidence, then you plan your instruction. So what knowledge and skill or way of thinking is worth devoting academic time? And why is this important enough for me not to be doing something else? In stage two, how will you know what they've learned, understood, or are able to do? You decided in stage one this was important for you enough, this was important enough for you to devote academic time to, so therefore it now should be important enough for you to devise a performance assessment that accurately measures what they have learned, what they understand, and what now they are able to do as a result of your instruction. In stage three, this gets to your pedagogy. How will you get your students to be able to do what you have decided is important enough for them to do and know, and also teach them in a fashion where what you're teaching them lines up with how it is that you're assessing them, so that you're not teaching them to list things if you then are going to ask them to write a 5-paragraph essay about persuading somebody about which side of the Civil War they should have fought on. So if you've decided that labeling the 50 states is a worthwhile set of knowledge that students need to have, then 9 chances out of 10, I probably need to have them actually label the map as a part of my instruction. So this is making sure that how you teach is aligned with how you assess, and it's also aligned with where it is that you want the students to end at the end.